Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, a secret has been festering for decades. A dossier so explosive, so damaging, that its very existence could topple governments and destroy reputations built over lifetimes. For years, whispers echoed through the marble corridors about documents that could expose the truth behind international deals, royal connections, and money that flowed like rivers between kingdoms. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, has always been known for her unwavering honesty and fierce independence. She speaks her mind when others bite their tongues. She stands firm when others bow. And now, in a moment that will shake the very foundations of the modern monarchy, she has decided to confirm what many suspected, but none dared to speak aloud. The Saudi dossier is real. These three words, spoken with the cold precision that has defined Princess Anne's public life, will unleash a storm that reaches far beyond the palace walls. In luxury mansions across California, Prince Harry will receive news that sends him into a rage so profound it threatens to destroy what little remains of his relationship with the family he once called home. What secrets lie within these pages? What truths have been hidden from the public eye? And why has Princess Anne chosen this moment, after years of silence, to confirm their existence? The answers will take you on a journey through palace intrigue, international politics, and family betrayals that run deeper than anyone imagined. You'll discover how a simple confirmation becomes the spark that ignites a fire threatening to consume the House of Windsor itself. This is not just another royal scandal. This is the moment when silence becomes impossible, when truth demands to be heard, and when the cost of loyalty finally becomes too high to pay. Are you ready to learn what Princess Anne knows? Are you prepared to understand why Harry's rage burns so bright it can be felt across an ocean? The story begins now, and nothing will ever be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Gatcombe Park as Princess Anne adjusted her riding helmet and prepared for what would become the most significant interview of her life. She had agreed to speak with veteran journalist Margaret Thornfield, a woman whose reputation for asking uncomfortable questions had made her both feared and respected throughout British media circles. Anne had chosen this setting deliberately. Here, surrounded by the horses she loved and the countryside that grounded her, she felt most herself. Protocols of Buckingham Palace, away from the watching eyes of courtiers and advisors. She could speak with the honesty that had always defined her character, even when that honesty made others uncomfortable. Margaret Thornfield arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had interviewed prime ministers and presidents. But there was something different about today's assignment. The questions she planned to ask had been brewing for months, carefully researched and cross-referenced with sources that spoke only in whispers and shadows. The two women settled into comfortable chairs on the terrace overlooking Anne's beloved estate. The Princess Royal wore her typical no-nonsense attire, a practical jacket, well-worn boots, and the kind of no-makeup look that suggested she had more important things to worry about than appearances. This was exactly the image she wanted to project for what was about to unfold. Margaret began with routine questions about Anne's charity work, her upcoming engagements, and her thoughts on the evolving role of the monarchy in modern Britain. Anne answered with her characteristic directness, never using 10 words when 5 would suffice, never softening hard truths with diplomatic language. For 30 minutes they danced around the real reason for this meeting, both women knowing that the moment of reckoning was approaching. Then Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. The question she asked next would echo around the world within hours of the interview's broadcast. Your Royal Highness, there have been persistent rumors for years about the existence of certain documents relating to Saudi Arabia and their connections to the royal family. Can you confirm or deny the existence of what some sources call the Saudi dossier? Anne didn't hesitate. In later interviews, Margaret would describe the moment as eerily calm, as if the princess had been waiting years for someone to finally ask the question. The dossier exists, Anne said simply, her blue eyes meeting Margaret's without wavering. It has existed for quite some time. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Margaret, despite her decades of experience, found herself momentarily speechless. She had expected deflection, perhaps anger, possibly even an end to the interview. She had not expected such straightforward confirmation. Can you elaborate on its contents? Margaret managed to ask, her professional composure quickly returning. Anne stood and walked to the edge of the terrace, her hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that was pure Windsor. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had carried secrets for far too long. The documents detail financial arrangements, agreements, and relationships that span several decades. They involve members of my family, representatives of the Saudi government, and various business interests. The arrangements documented therein would be considered problematic by many people if they became public knowledge. Margaret scribbled notes frantically, her heart racing as she realized the magnitude of what Princess Anne was revealing. "Why are you choosing to confirm this now?" Anne turned back to face her interviewer, and for the first time Margaret saw something that might have been sadness in the princess's eyes. "Because silence has a price," Anne said quietly, "and I've decided I'm no longer willing to pay it." The interview continued for another hour, with Anne providing carefully measured responses that confirmed the existence of the dossier without revealing its specific contents. She spoke about the burden of family loyalty, the cost of keeping secrets that weren't entirely her own, and the growing weight of watching from the sidelines as those secrets affected people she cared about. She was particularly cryptic when asked about how the dossier might affect other family members, but her expression darkened noticeably when Margaret mentioned Prince Harry's name. "Harry has made his choices," Anne said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "They in public forums, to profit from private pain, and to damage relationships that took generations to build. He cannot expect others to remain silent indefinitely about matters that concern him, especially when his own silence has been selective." Margaret pressed for clarification, but Anne simply shook her head. "He will understand soon enough." As the interview concluded, Margaret felt she had witnessed something historic, though she wasn't yet sure of its full significance. Anne walked her to her car, maintaining the polite conversation expected of such occasions, but there was an underlying tension that suggested this was just the beginning of something much larger. After Margaret's departure, Anne returned to the terrace and sat alone for a long time, staring out across the countryside. She had crossed a line today, one she could never uncross. The confirmation of the Saudi dossier's existence would unleash forces she couldn't control, would hurt people she loved, and would forever change the landscape of the royal family's relationship with the public, that it would also free her from a burden she had carried for too long. As the granddaughter of a king and the daughter of a queen, Anne had learned early that duty often demanded sacrifice. Today she had decided that her duty lay not in protecting old secrets, but in acknowledging their existence before they destroyed more than they protected. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in a sprawling Montecito mansion, Prince Harry was completely unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. Security in their immaculate garden, secure in his new California life and confident that the worst of his family drama was behind him, he had no idea that within hours his phone would ring with news that would send him into a rage so profound it would be felt on both sides of the Atlantic. He had no idea that his aunt's words, spoken so calmly in an English country garden, would force him to confront truths he had spent years trying to avoid. The dossier Anne had confirmed was not just any collection of documents. It contained information that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative Harry had built around his departure from royal life. It held secrets that painted his actions in a very different light. Secrets that suggested his motivations for leaving the royal family might not have been as pure as he had claimed. As Anne sat on her terrace that morning, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, she knew she had lit a fuse that would explode across international headlines. The Saudi dossier was real, she had confirmed its existence, and now the world would demand to know what it contained. But even Anne, with all her experience of palace intrigue and royal politics, could not have predicted the full extent of what would unfold in the days and weeks to come. She had spoken her truth, as was her way, but truth has a way of creating consequences that extend far beyond the intentions of those who speak it. The confirmation had been given. The die was cast. And somewhere in California, Prince Harry was about to discover that his past had not been left behind as completely as he had hoped. The reckoning was coming, and it would spare no one. The call came at exactly 3:47 a.m. California time, jarring Prince Harry from a deep sleep in his Montecito bedroom. The number displayed on his phone screen belonged to his private secretary, a discreet man named James Whitfield who had served the royal family for over 2 decades before following Harry to America. James never called at this hour unless something catastrophic had occurred. Harry sat up in bed, careful not to wake Meghan, and answered with the groggy confusion of someone pulled from sleep. "James? What's happened?" The voice on the other end was tense, professional, but carrying an undercurrent of panic that immediately brought Harry fully awake. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid we have a significant situation developing. Princess Anne has given an interview that was broadcast an hour ago on BBC One. She has confirmed the existence of the Saudi dossier." For a moment, Harry said nothing. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their meaning so enormous that his mind struggled to process them. The Saudi dossier, the collection of documents he had hoped would remain buried forever, that contained information so damaging it could destroy not just his carefully crafted public image, but potentially his entire life in America. What? Harry's voice was barely a whisper, but there was already an edge of rage building beneath the shock. James continued, his words precise and measured despite the early hour. "She confirmed its existence on record, sir. She didn't reveal specific contents, but she made it clear that the documents are real and contain what she described as problematic financial arrangements involving family members and Saudi interests. The story has already been picked up by major news outlets worldwide." Harry was out of bed now, pacing across the moonlit bedroom like a caged animal. His mind raced through the implications, each one more devastating than the last. The dossier contained evidence of financial arrangements he had been involved with during his final years as a working royal, arrangements that directly contradicted the narrative he had built around his departure from the family. More damaging still, the documents showed payments and agreements that suggested his decision to leave royal life had been motivated not by concerns about media treatment or family dynamics, but by pressure from these Saudi connections when they became politically inconvenient. If the public learned the truth about these arrangements, everything he had said in his interviews with Oprah, in his book, in countless public appearances, would be revealed as carefully constructed lies. "How much did she reveal?" Harry asked, his voice now sharp with anger. "She was careful about specifics, but she made several references that suggest she knows about your involvement, sir. She mentioned that family members who have chosen to air private business cannot expect others to remain silent indefinitely. Given the timing and context, most observers are interpreting this as a direct reference to you." Harry stopped pacing and stared out the window at the manicured grounds of his estate. In the distance, the mountains of California rose against the star-filled sky, a view that usually brought him peace. On tonight, it looked like a prison wall. "Why now?" he muttered. More to himself than to James. Why would she do this now? But even as he asked the question, Harry knew the answer. Anne had always been the most straightforward member of the royal family, the one most likely to speak uncomfortable truths when she felt they needed to be spoken. She had watched him profit from his tell-all interviews and book deals, watched him build a media empire on the foundation of family grievances, and apparently decided that if he could reveal family secrets, so could she. The difference was that Anne's secrets were backed by documents, financial records, and recorded conversations. Her truths could be proven in ways that his emotional narratives could not. James's voice brought Harry back to the immediate crisis. "We need to discuss response strategies." The phones haven't stopped ringing since the interview aired. Everyone wants a statement. Harry's rage, which had been building steadily since the call began, finally erupted. "Response strategies? James, do you understand what this means? Do you comprehend what she's done?" His voice rose to a shout that he quickly tried to suppress, glancing toward the bed where Meghan still slept. But the fury was beyond his control now, a red-hot anger that threatened to consume everything in its path. "She's destroyed everything," Harry hissed into the phone, his voice venomous with rage. "Years of work. Years of building this life, this brand, this narrative about why we left. All of it gone because my dear aunt decided she'd had enough of keeping quiet." Harry moved to his home office, closing the door behind him, before allowing his anger to find its full voice. The room, decorated with awards and photographs from his charitable work, seemed to mock him now. Every achievement, every public appearance, every carefully crafted statement about his journey away from royal life would now be scrutinized through the lens of what the Saudi dossier might reveal. "What exactly is in these documents?" Harry demanded. "Give me the worst-case scenario." James had clearly prepared for this question. "The documents reportedly include bank statements showing payments to accounts connected to you during 2018 and 2019. They show communications between your representatives and Saudi officials regarding various business arrangements. Most significantly, they apparently contain recordings of conversations where you discussed using your royal status to facilitate certain investments and deals. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. Those conversations, which he had assumed were private and would never see the light of day, contained admissions that would destroy his credibility completely. In them, he had discussed leveraging his royal connections for personal gain, had complained about the restrictions placed on working royals, and had explored ways to monetize his position without technically violating royal protocol. If those recordings became public, they would prove that his departure from royal life had nothing to do with the noble motivations he had claimed. They would show that he had been actively working to profit from his royal status while still a working member of the family, and that his ultimate decision to leave had been forced by the discovery of these arrangements, not driven by concerns about his wife's treatment or his own mental health. "How long do we have before the contents become public?" Harry asked, his strategic mind already working through damage control scenarios. "That's unclear, sir." Anne seemed to suggest that she has no intention of revealing the contents herself, but she also made it clear that she would no longer deny the dossier's existence. This opens the door for investigative journalists, parliamentary inquiries, and potentially legal proceedings that could force disclosure. Harry slammed his fist down on his desk, sending a glass of water crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass seemed to crystallize his fury into something sharp and focused. "She's clever, isn't she?" Harry said, his voice now cold with calculated anger. "She doesn't have to reveal anything herself. She just confirms it exists and lets others do the dirty work. She gets to maintain her reputation for honesty while watching my life burn down around me." The implications continued to unfold in Harry's mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. His lucrative deals with streaming services, his book contracts, his speaking engagements, all of them were built on his credibility as someone who had sacrificed financial security to protect his family and speak his truth. If that foundation crumbled, everything else would come down with it. Worse still, the damage would extend beyond his professional life. His relationship with Meghan was built partly on their shared narrative of being victims of an unfair system. If it emerged that Harry had actually been working the system for personal gain while publicly criticizing it, the strain on their marriage could be enormous. "We need to get ahead of this," Harry said finally, his voice steady despite the rage still burning beneath the surface. "We need to control the narrative before someone else does." "What do you want to tell the press, sir?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the California dawn that was beginning to break over the mountains. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold calculation of someone who had learned to survive in the brutal world of modern media. "We tell them that Princess Anne's comments are taken out of context, that any documents she's referring to are either fabricated or represent normal business activities that were fully disclosed to appropriate authorities. We position this as another attempt to undermine our life in America." But even as he said the words, Harry knew they sounded weak. Anne's reputation for unvarnished honesty would carry far more weight than his denials, especially given his history of changing his story when pressed for details. The conversation with James continued for another 30 minutes, covering immediate press strategy, legal options, and damage control measures. But as Harry finally hung up the phone and sat alone in his office, he understood that his carefully constructed new life was under assault in a way that might prove impossible to defend against. Princess Anne had fired the first shot in what was about to become a war between two very different visions of truth. Their version was backed by documents, recordings, and the kind of evidence that couldn't be dismissed as misremembering or emotional interpretation. Harry's version was built on narrative, emotion, and public sympathy. In a court of law, Anne's weapons would prove far more powerful than his. As the sun rose over Montecito, casting golden light across his expensive estate, Prince Harry sat surrounded by the trappings of his American dream and contemplated its possible destruction. The Saudi dossier was real, its existence was now public knowledge, and the woman who had confirmed it was someone whose word carried the weight of decades of unquestioned integrity. The war for the truth about Prince Harry's departure from royal life was about to begin, and for the first time since leaving England, he wasn't sure he was going to win. By the time Meghan woke up that morning, the story had exploded across every major news platform in the world. The headline, "Princess Anne confirms Saudi dossier exists," dominated front pages from London to New York, From Sydney to Tokyo, social media was ablaze with speculation, analysis, and increasingly pointed questions about what the documents might contain and why Princess Anne had chosen this moment to confirm their existence. Meghan found Harry in his office, still wearing the clothes he had slept in, surrounded by laptops, phones, and the kind of organized chaos that emerged when crisis management took over their lives. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep and stress, his jaw set in the hard line she had learned to recognize as his battle face. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly, closing the door behind her. Harry looked up from the screen he had been staring at, his expression grim. "It's catastrophic. Anne has basically given every investigative journalist in the world permission to start digging into something that should have stayed buried forever." Meghan moved to stand behind his chair, reading over his shoulder as he scrolled through article after article. The Guardian had already published a lengthy analysis piece connecting Princess Anne's comments to various business dealings that had raised questions during Harry's final years as a working royal. The Daily Mail was predictably sensational, with speculation about secret recordings and financial impropriety. Even the traditionally restrained Financial Times had picked up the story, focusing on the potential implications for international business relationships. "What exactly is in this dossier?" Meghan asked, though she suspected she already knew at least part of the answer. Harry spun his chair around to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "Evidence of things I did that don't exactly align with the story we've been telling about why we left." The weight of his words hung between them. Their entire public narrative, their brand, their credibility with the American public, all of it was built on the foundation that they had left royal life because of how Meghan was treated and Harry's concerns about repeating his mother's fate. If it emerged that Harry had actually been involved in questionable business dealings that forced their departure, the sympathy that had sustained them through their transition would evaporate overnight. "Tell me everything," Meghan said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Over the next hour, Harry laid out the full scope of what the Saudi dossier likely contained. The financial arrangements he had entered into during 2018 and 2019, using his royal connections to facilitate investments and business deals. The payments he had received for introductions and endorsements that skirted the edges of what was permissible for working royals. The conversations he had recorded, thinking they were private, where he had discussed ways to monetize his royal status more effectively. Most damaging of all were the recordings from late 2019, made during meetings with Saudi representatives, where Harry had expressed frustration with royal restrictions and had actively explored ways to maintain his royal titles while pursuing commercial opportunities that would normally be forbidden. These recordings captured him at his most calculating, discussing strategies to have his cake and eat it too, to maintain royal prestige while pursuing American-style celebrity wealth. Meghan listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the full picture emerged. When Harry finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she had learned. "So when we left," she said finally, "it wasn't really because of media treatment or family pressure. It was because someone was about to expose these business dealings." Harry nodded reluctantly. "The palace found out about the Saudi arrangements in January 2020. That's what really triggered our departure. Everything else, all the reasons we've given publicly, they were real concerns, but they weren't what forced our hand." The admission hung between them like a poison cloud. Their entire public narrative, the interviews, the book, the countless statements about their motivations, all of it would be revealed as, at best, partial truths designed to obscure more complicated realities. Meghan stood and walked to the window, staring out at their perfect California life. How long before the recordings become public? Could be days, could be months. Depends on how aggressive the journalists get, whether there are any legal challenges, whether other family members decide to confirm or deny specific details.
As if summoned by his words, Harry's phone rang.
The caller ID showed his brother William's private number, a sight that would have been shocking under normal circumstances. The two brothers had barely spoken since Harry's departure, communicating only through intermediaries and lawyers when absolutely necessary. Harry answered on the third ring. "William." "Harry." William's voice was cold, formal, carrying the tone he used for official business rather than family conversations. "I assume you've seen the news." "Yes, then you understand the position this puts the entire family in. Anne may have confirmed the dossier's existence, but the contents implicate all of us by association. Every business relationship, every charitable partnership, every international agreement we have is now under scrutiny because of your choices." Harry felt his anger flare again. My choices? This wouldn't be an issue if Anne had kept her mouth shut like she's supposed to. Anne kept quiet for 2 years while you profited from airing family grievances. She watched you build a media empire on half-truths and carefully omitted facts. Did you really think she would stay silent forever while you damaged the institution she's dedicated her life to serving? The brothers' conversation quickly devolved into the kind of bitter argument that had characterized their relationship since Harry's departure. William accused Harry of selfishness and short-sightedness. Harry countered that the family had driven him away and now wanted to destroy him for building a new life. Neither man was willing to acknowledge the other's perspective, and the call ended with both of them angrier than before. But William's words had struck home. Harry had indeed profited enormously from his royal connections and his willingness to discuss family dynamics publicly. Presentation. His book advance alone had been 8 figures. His streaming deals worth millions more. He had leveraged his royal status and personal grievances into a fortune that dwarfed what he could have earned as a working royal. The problem was that this success had been built on a foundation of public sympathy that depended on his narrative of victimhood being true and complete. If the Saudi dossier revealed that his departure had been motivated by self-interest rather than principle, that foundation would crumble. Meghan had been watching Harry during his conversation with William, and she could see the growing desperation in his expression. When he hung up, she moved to sit on the arm of his chair. What are our options? She asked practically. Harry scrolled through his contacts, considering who might be able to help. His legal team was already working on potential responses, but their options were limited. The documents existed, Princess Anne had confirmed as much, and her reputation for honesty meant that denials would likely be ineffective. We could try to get ahead of the story, Harry said slowly. Admit to some version of the truth before the worst details come out. Try to control the narrative. And say what? That you were involved in business dealings that contradicted everything we've said about why we left? Harry was quiet for a long moment. Maybe we frame it as evolution. Say that my understanding of my situation changed over time, that I initially tried to find ways to serve the crown while supporting my family, but ultimately realized the system was irreparably broken. It was weak, and they both knew it. The sophisticated audiences that had embraced their story of principled departure would not easily accept such a significant revision of the facts. More importantly, the recordings would likely reveal Harry in moments of calculated self-interest that would be impossible to spin as noble evolution. As the morning wore on, the crisis deepened. Harry's representatives were fielding hundreds of media requests. Several major outlets were reportedly assembling teams of investigative journalists to pursue the Saudi dossier story. Legal experts were already speculating about potential parliamentary inquiries and freedom of information requests that could force disclosure of government documents related to the case. Most troubling of all, sources close to Princess Anne were suggesting that she had more information than she had revealed in the initial interview. Some reports hinted that Anne had copies of key documents and recordings, and that she was prepared to provide them to appropriate authorities if necessary to verify their authenticity. Harry realized with growing horror that Anne had not acted impulsively. This was a carefully planned revelation timed for maximum impact and designed to force the truth into the open. She had apparently spent months, perhaps years, preparing for this moment, gathering evidence and building an unassailable case. The woman who had always been the most direct member of the royal family had finally decided that Harry's version of the truth had been allowed to stand unchallenged for too long. She was calling his bluff, and she held all the cards. As afternoon turned to evening in California, Harry found himself facing the possibility that everything he had built in America might collapse. The streaming deals, the book contracts, the speaking engagements, all of them could disappear if his credibility was destroyed. Or still, the damage to his reputation might be so severe that no amount of money or celebrity connections could restore it. The phone kept ringing throughout the day, but Harry had stopped answering. Routine protest. Each call brought worse news, more aggressive questions, additional evidence that the story was spiraling beyond anyone's control. In the gathering darkness of his Montecito office, Prince Harry contemplated the ruins of his carefully constructed narrative and wondered if there was any way to survive what was coming. Princess Anne had lit a fuse that was burning toward an explosion that would reshape not just his life, but the entire landscape of royal scandal and public accountability. The storm was only beginning, and Harry was starting to understand that he might not be strong enough to weather what was coming. 3 days after Princess Anne's bombshell interview, the first major leak occurred. The Guardian published excerpts from what they claimed were authenticated documents from the Saudi dossier, including bank records showing payments of over £2 million to accounts linked to Prince Harry between 2018 and 2019. The payments were described as consultancy fees and introduction commissions, but the timing coincided exactly with several high-profile business deals involving Saudi investors and British companies where Harry had provided access and endorsements. Harry read the article with mounting dread. The journalists had clearly been given access to copies of the actual documents, not just secondhand information. Someone with direct access to the dossier was actively feeding information to the press, and the methodical way the story was being released suggested this was just the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign of disclosure. The reaction was immediate and devastating. By noon, streaming executives were asking for emergency meetings, publishers were reviewing contract terms, charitable organizations that had partnered with Harry and Meghan were quietly distancing themselves. The couple's representatives spent the day fielding cancellations and requests for clarification that sounded more like ultimatums. Most painfully, American media figures who had embraced Harry's story began to express doubt publicly. Oprah Winfrey's representative issued a statement saying she had been given assurances that Harry's account of his departure from royal life was complete and accurate. The subtext was clear. If those assurances proved false, their relationship would be reassessed. Meghan found Harry in their home gym at 3 a.m, pounding away on the treadmill with an intensity that bordered on self-punishment. Sweat poured down his face, but his expression was fixed in the kind of grim determination that had characterized his military service. "You can't run away from this," she said quietly, turning off the machine. Harry stepped off the treadmill, breathing heavily. "I'm not running away. I'm trying to think." But they both knew that thinking time was a luxury they no longer possessed. Events were moving too quickly, and each day brought fresh revelations that made their position more untenable. The carefully constructed narrative that had sustained them for 2 years was crumbling in real time, and there seemed to be no way to stop the collapse. "Maybe we should go back to England," Meghan suggested. "Face this directly instead of trying to manage it from a distance." Harry shook his head immediately. Going back would look like surrender. It would validate everything they're saying about us running away when things got difficult. As opposed to staying here and watching our entire life get destroyed by remote control, the argument that followed was the most bitter of their marriage, touching on fears and resentments that had been building since the crisis began. Meghan accused Harry of lying to her about the true reasons for their departure. Harry countered that she had been eager enough to profit from their royal connections when it served their purposes. Both of them said things they would later regret, but in the heat of the moment, the stress of their situation made restraint impossible. The fight ended with Meghan leaving for their guest house and Harry sitting alone in their darkened home, contemplating how quickly everything had fallen apart. Just a week ago, they had been secure in their American life, confident in their brand, and comfortable with their version of the truth. Now they were questioning everything they had built together. The next morning brought news that would make their personal crisis seem manageable by comparison. The BBC announced that they had obtained audio recordings from the Saudi dossier and would be broadcasting selected excerpts that evening. The promotional material promised shocking revelations about Prince Harry's business activities and his real motivations for leaving royal life. Harry knew exactly which recordings they had obtained, and the knowledge made him physically ill. The conversations captured him at his most calculating and self-interested, discussing ways to monetize his royal status while maintaining public sympathy as a victim of the system. In one particularly damaging segment, he could be heard laughing about the gullibility of the American public and their eagerness to embrace anyone who criticized the British establishment. The broadcast that evening was watched by over 15 million people in the UK alone, with additional millions streaming it online worldwide. The excerpts were devastating, not just because of what they revealed about Harry's business activities, but because of the casual cynicism they displayed toward the public that had embraced his story. In one recording, Harry could be heard saying, "The Americans eat this stuff up out there. You tell them you're a victim of the British class system, and they'll throw money at you. They love the idea that they're more enlightened than their former colonial masters." In another, discussing his book deal, Harry said, "I can write anything I want about my family, and they can't respond publicly without looking petty. It's the perfect scam." I get paid millions to settle old scores, and I come out looking like the honest one. Most damaging of all was a conversation where Harry discussed his wife's treatment by the British press. Meghan's willing to play the victim as long as it serves our purposes, he said. She knows the race angle works perfectly in America. It gives us moral authority that's almost impossible to challenge. The reaction to the broadcast was swift and brutal. Social media exploded with anger from people who felt they had been manipulated and deceived. American commentators who had defended Harry and Meghan now turned against them with the fury of the betrayed. British public opinion, which had been slowly warming to Harry over the past year, hardened into something approaching hatred. The damage extended beyond public opinion. Within hours of the broadcast, Netflix announced they were reviewing their relationship with the couple's production company. Spotify issued a statement distancing themselves from previous projects. Random House, Harry's publisher, quietly removed promotional materials for his book from their website. Harry watched the collapse of his media empire from his Montecito mansion, surrounded by the trappings of success that now felt like monuments to his own hubris. The man who had gambled everything on his ability to control the narrative was learning that some stories are too big to be contained by even the most sophisticated public relations machinery. But the personal cost was even higher than the professional damage. Meghan returned from the guest house that evening, but their conversation was stilted and careful, as if they were strangers negotiating a business arrangement rather than spouses facing a crisis together. The recordings had revealed aspects of Harry's character that she was struggling to reconcile with the man she had married. "Did you mean what you said about me in those recordings?" she asked finally. Harry wanted to lie, to claim the words were taken out of context or that he had been playing a role for the Saudi representatives. But he was too exhausted for elaborate deceptions, and Meghan deserved better than more lies. "Some of it," he admitted. "I was angry about how things had worked out, and I said things I shouldn't have said. But the feelings behind them, yes, some of that was real." The admission hung between them like a physical barrier. Meghan had built her life in America partly on the belief that she and Harry were united against unfair treatment, that they were victims of circumstances beyond their control. Learning that Harry had viewed their situation as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a tragedy to be endured changed everything between them. "So what now?" she asked. Harry had no answer. The recordings had destroyed his credibility so thoroughly that traditional damage control measures seemed pointless. He could apologize, but who would believe the sincerity of someone who had been caught on tape discussing how to manipulate public sympathy? He could claim the recordings were doctored, but Princess Anne's reputation and the BBC's verification process made such claims unlikely to succeed. For the first time since leaving England, Harry faced the possibility that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. His gamble on American celebrity and media success had paid off spectacularly for 2 years, but it had been built on foundations that were always more fragile than they appeared. Now that those foundations were cracking, everything he had constructed was coming down with them. As night fell over California, Harry sat alone in his study surrounded by awards and photographs that documented his American success. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, new damage, and additional evidence that his carefully constructed new life was built on lies that could no longer be sustained. Princess Anne had kept her promise to remain silent about the contents of the Saudi dossier, but she had also made it impossible for others to maintain that silence. By confirming the document's existence, she had opened floodgates that no amount of money or influence could close. The reckoning Harry had feared for years was finally at hand, and he was beginning to understand that there might be no way to survive it with his reputation, his marriage, or his American dream intact. The woman who had always been known for her uncompromising honesty had finally forced him to confront the consequences of his own compromises with the truth. The unraveling was accelerating, and Harry was running out of time to control the narrative of his own destruction. 2 weeks after the first recordings were broadcast, Harry found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. Completely alone in his Montecito mansion, his marriage strained to the breaking point, his business empire in ruins, and his future in America hanging by the thinnest of threads. The relentless drumbeat of revelations from the Saudi dossier had stripped away every layer of protection he had built around his new life. The final blow had come that morning in the form of a letter delivered by courier from Meghan's attorney. She was not filing for divorce, not yet, but she was taking their children to stay with friends while she reassessed their situation. The letter was carefully worded and legally precise, but its emotional message was clear. The man she had married was not the man she had discovered in those recordings. Harry sat in his kitchen, staring at the letter while CNN played silently on the television, showing yet another panel discussion about his downfall. The experts who had once praised his courage for speaking truth to power now analyzed his psychological profile and debated whether he had been a calculating manipulator from the beginning or simply someone who had lost his way under pressure. The house felt enormous and empty around him. Staff members had been quietly leaving over the past week, unwilling to associate themselves with the scandal that showed no signs of abating. The security team remained, but even they seemed to regard him with a mixture of pity and professional detachment that made his isolation even more complete. His phone, which had once buzzed constantly with opportunities and invitations, now sat silent on the counter. The few calls that came were from lawyers, accountants, and crisis management specialists, delivering increasingly grim assessments of his situation. The financial implications alone were staggering. Contract cancellations, potential lawsuits for misrepresentation, and the collapse of brand partnerships that had been worth tens of millions of dollars. But the money, devastating as its loss was, paled in comparison to the personal reckoning that Harry faced. The recordings had revealed not just his business activities but aspects of his character that he had hidden even from himself. The casual cynicism with which he had discussed manipulating public sentiment, the calculating way he had approached his relationships with American media figures, the cold analysis of how to leverage his family's pain for personal profit. Princess Anne had never released the recordings herself, but her confirmation of the dossier's existence had made their discovery inevitable. Investigative journalists, parliamentary committees, and legal authorities had all demanded access to documents that the royal family could no longer claim didn't exist. Anne had simply opened the door. Others had walked through it to devastating effect. The cruelest irony was that Anne herself had remained largely silent throughout the entire crisis. She had given no additional interviews, made no public statements, and offered no commentary on the destruction her initial confirmation had unleashed. Her silence was more powerful than any accusation could have been, carrying the weight of someone who had spoken the truth and then allowed it to work its inevitable consequences. Harry found himself thinking about their last conversation, which had taken place over 2 years ago during one of the final family gatherings before his departure from royal life. Anne had been characteristically direct in her assessment of his plans to pursue commercial opportunities in America. "You're playing with fire," she had told him bluntly. "You think you can control how this story gets told, but stories have a way of escaping the people who try to contain them. Truth always finds a way to surface, Harry, and when it does, it doesn't care about the damage it causes." At the time, he had dismissed her warnings as the typical pessimism of someone who had never taken real risks. Now he understood that she had seen exactly what would happen, had perhaps even known about the Saudi arrangements that would eventually destroy his credibility. Her recent revelations hadn't been impulsive acts of revenge. They had been the inevitable conclusion of a process that had been set in motion years earlier. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas Hartwell, a longtime friend from Harry's military days, arrived unannounced and was admitted by the security team who recognized him from previous visits. Thomas was one of the few people in Harry's life who had no commercial or professional connection to his American ventures, someone who could speak honestly without agenda. "You look like hell," Thomas said without preamble as he found Harry sitting in the study surrounded by legal documents and financial statements. "I feel worse than I look," Harry replied, gesturing for his friend to sit down. "I assume you've been following the news." Thomas nodded grimly. "Hard to avoid it. The recordings are everywhere. I've got friends calling me from 3 continents asking if you really said those things." "I did." Harry's admission was flat, emotionless, the confession of someone who had moved beyond shame into something approaching numbness. "Every word of it." "Why?" Thomas asked simply. "Why risk everything for money you didn't really need? Why treat people who trusted you like marks in a confidence game?" It was the question Harry had been asking himself for weeks, and he still didn't have a satisfactory answer. The financial arrangements with the Saudis had begun small, seemingly harmless introductions and endorsements that leveraged his royal connections in ways that weren't technically prohibited. But success had bred ambition, and ambition had led to increasingly complex schemes that pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable for a working royal. I think I started believing my own narrative, Harry said slowly. I convinced myself that I was the victim of an unfair system, that I was entitled to compensation for everything I had sacrificed. It became easy to justify anything that served my interests. And Megan, did she know? Harry shook his head. We had opportunities, but I kept her isolated from the specifics. I told myself I was protecting her, but really I was protecting myself from having to defend choices I knew she wouldn't approve of. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Thomas asking the hard questions that no one else in Harry's life had been willing or able to pose. It became a kind of confession, with Harry finally acknowledging the full scope of his deceptions and self-deceptions over the past several years. When Thomas left, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced since the crisis began, a strange kind of relief. The exhausting work of maintaining facades and managing narratives was over. The truth was public, devastating and complete, and there was something almost liberating about no longer having to pretend otherwise. That evening, Harry made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his brother William directly, not through intermediaries or representatives, but from his personal phone to William's private number. The conversation that followed was brief and painful, but it marked the beginning of what might eventually become a path back to some kind of honest relationship with his family. I know you have no reason to believe me, Harry told William, but I want you to know that I understand what I've done. To you, to the family, to the institution. Program that I needed you to hear me acknowledge it directly. William's response was cautious but not entirely hostile. The recordings speak for themselves, Harry. But hearing you take responsibility is something. The call ended without resolution, but with the possibility that honest conversation might eventually be possible again. It was more than Harry had dared hope for in weeks of complete isolation from his family. Late that night, as Harry sat alone in his study with the California stars visible through the windows, he contemplated what remained of his life and what he might be able to build from the wreckage. His American dream was over, his marriage was hanging by a thread, and his public reputation was destroyed beyond repair. But for the first time in years, he was confronting reality without the filters of self-serving narratives and strategic omissions. The Princess Anne had forced this reckoning through her simple confirmation that the Saudi dossier existed. She had known that truth, once acknowledged, would demand its full revelation regardless of the cost to the people it implicated. Her decision to speak had been an act of institutional loyalty that transcended personal relationships and family bonds. Harry understood now that Anne's revelations hadn't been about destroying him personally, though that had been the inevitable result. They had been about preserving the integrity of an institution that she had served faithfully for over 50 years. She had decided that allowing his false narratives to stand unchallenged would cause more long-term damage to the monarchy than forcing the truth into the open, regardless of who got hurt in the process. As dawn broke over the California mountains, Harry realized that his rage at Princess Anne had finally burned itself out. In its place was something that might eventually become understanding, and possibly even a grudging respect for someone who had chosen principle over personal comfort in a way that he himself had failed to do. The reckoning was complete. The truth had been told in all its devastating completeness. What came next would depend on whether Harry could find the courage to build something honest from the ruins of his carefully constructed lies, or whether the weight of his failures would crush any possibility of redemption. Princess Anne had confirmed the existence of the Saudi dossier, and in doing so, she had changed everything. The question now was whether anything worth preserving could survive the complete destruction of the myths that had sustained Prince Harry's American adventure. The final chapter of this story was still being written, but its opening lines had been composed with the brutal honesty that Princess Anne had always represented. Truth had triumphed over narrative, and the consequences would reshape not just Harry's life, but the entire landscape of royal accountability for generations to come.